Right, hello everybody. My name is Jose Lopez, and today I want to give you all an informative speech about the health risks that boxers and MMA fighters face every day on a daily basis. I think it's important that we understand these fighters chase their dreams, fame, fortune, and money, all at the expense of their health. And we as people being entertained should be if we learn what exactly they put themselves at risk, then we could further appreciate the sport we are watching. So I want to talk about body injuries and health injuries. And starting off with body injuries, there's a YouTube channel called Fight Tips, and they explain why the limbs are a big target and weak point on fighters. So for example, biceps and quadriceps are big chunky muscles, and if a fighter gets hit hard enough on them, excuse me, they'll be caused to cramp up. Another interesting weak point would be joints such as elbows and knees. If a fighter gets hit hard enough on these joints, they can be caused to hyperextend, and essentially their joints could pop out or the joints could break. More often than not, if their joints start to are broken or pop out, then they can't continue the fight. Another interesting another interesting weak point would be the shoulders. So oftentimes fighters target shoulders to throw their victims off balance and off rhythm. And what this does is, if a fighter gets thrown off his rhythm, it can lead for the opponent to land a devastating combination. Another interesting area where there are a lot of body injuries would be the torso itself. So for example, the stomach. If a fighter gets hit on his stomach, he could get shocked from it, and he could have the wind knocked out of him. Similarly, the solar plexus is another weak point, because if a fighter gets hit there, the wind will be knocked out of him as well. And probably the worst type of body injury somebody could sustain is a liver punch. If somebody gets hit on the liver, they'll feel immediate, immense pain, and essentially they'll be incapacitated, and more often than not, they'll have to stop the fight. It's interesting because the body on an individual is kind of like the second biggest weak point. The biggest weak point would be the head. And it is important to understand that the head is the biggest target, and in turn often leads to severe head injury down in the future of a fighter. So there's a couple different types of head injuries I'll be talking about. But the first one is called the TBI. TBI stands for traumatic brain injury. So what a TBI is, it actually covers a variety of different head injuries. Essentially, it's a concussion. A TBI is a concussion. That's what we can most commonly refer to. So Mayfield Clinic actually describes TBI as having a primary and a secondary effect. The primary effect is the initial blow to the head. The brain will rattle, and then it will hit the skull. That is the concussion. The secondary effect is when that portion of the brain stops rattling, it will begin to swell up, and then it will press up against the skull. And in turn, this leads to lack of oxygen going to the brain. So the secondary effect could be much worse than the primary, because if a person doesn't have enough oxygen going to the brain, they could lose consciousness and even die. So another type of head injury I like to talk about is called the CTE. CTE stands for chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Now, what exactly is CTE? There's a group called Clinical Correlations, and they describe CTE as chronic TBI. So what does this mean? Basically, when a fighter gets a lot of TBIs, they'll essentially start to produce symptoms of CTE, and down the line in their careers, they'll develop CTE. CTE is known as drunk punch syndrome because it's known to produce similar effects or symptoms that of a drunk person would actually have or show. There's an article called Dangers of MMA and the Development of CTE that tells us that sublethal blows to the head cause behavioral symptoms or drunk punch syndrome. Sharon Salt from the Neurocentral Group tells us that CTE is a neurodegenerative disease and causes memory loss, Parkinson's, slurred speech, confusion, and disorientation. And the last head injury I think I like to talk about is essentially death. If a fighter gets hit hard enough in his head, it could cause him to to bleed from his brain, or he could have a seizure. He could put into a permanent coma and never wake up. That's always a worst case scenario in any fight and fighter. And that brings me to my conclusion. I feel as if we understand exactly what these fighters go through, we can learn to appreciate what they do, especially if they put their health on the line and their lives on the line. That concludes my speech. Thank you.